The need for a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, and establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploration of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. Wow. Karl Marx must be anti-Semitic, right? Because he's critiquing globalism. You can't do that. Can't critique globalism. You can't critique, the global financial capitalist system. Oh no, you can't critique that. You can't critique, a global market spreading its tentacles all over the world, right? Haven't you watched Vosh? Haven't you watched ContraPoints? That's anti-Semitism. Oh boy, that's Karl Marx, right? About how capitalism is spreading. It's given the world market a cosmopolitan character in consumption to every country. This is Karl Marx. And that brings me to another very, very important part of what he says. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and exchange, is like a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. I don't know if you've ever watched Fantasia. You've heard the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? The idea is this is a magician who suddenly, he calls up all these demons from the netherworld. He does all this magic, but he loses control of it. That in their drive for profits, they lose control of the forces that they're driving forth. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of a revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention that the commercial crises, by their periodic return, put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, also the created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity. The epidemic of overproduction. Society finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, and too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further to the development and the conditions of society. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered. And soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder to the whole of bourgeois society. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of mass productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. Now, what is he saying here? He's pointing out that capitalism is the only system in history where people have been hungry because there's too much food. Capitalism is the only system in history where people have been homeless because there are too many houses. Capitalism creates a situation where abundance creates poverty. And that's what he's talking about. Abundance creates poverty. An epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity. The epidemic of overproduction. Society finds itself into a state of momentary barbarism. Why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, and too much commerce. Capitalism, by advancing technology, by reaching technological progress, by creating more and more products, leads to a situation where people become poorer and poorer and poorer. The more we advance technologically, the poorer people get. And how do they then resolve these crises? How does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by more thorough exploitation of the old ones. The conquest of new markets, seizing new markets with war, on the one hand, and two, by driving down everyone's wages and living standards, conquering more thorough exploitation of the workers that they already have. Driving down working conditions, hiring fewer and fewer workers. Those are the only ways they can get over the crises. And every time they get over a crisis this way, he goes on, they pave the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. You can only go to so many places. You can only conquer so many new markets. That is the problem of capitalism. The problem of capitalism isn't simply a matter of inequality. The problem of capitalism isn't that it creates too many things. The problem is that the more capitalism produces, the more efficient the means of production become, the poorer people get. That under capitalism, abundance creates poverty. The more wealth that exists, the poorer people get. Because under capitalism, the only value for the worker is as a consumer. I've often quoted the coal miner's riddle. I've quoted it on here many times. The little boy is cold. He says to his father, "Father, why is it so cold?" The father says, "Because we can't afford any coal to heat the stove." The boy says to his father, "Why is it so cold? Why can't you afford any coal to heat the stove?" And he says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." And he says, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there's too much coal." That's capitalism. That's capitalism in a nutshell. Right? Poverty created by abundance. And the problem with capitalism is the more wealth they create, the more they advance technology, the fewer workers they hire, the less we get paid in wages as workers, and the poorer everyone gets. That's the problem of capitalism. Capitalism leads to a situation where abundance and poverty walk hand in hand.